Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Three and a Possible. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this video series. This is our probably like our 10th or 12th episode. So excited for our guest today. As we know, histories are often multi-layered, and the name of this show is no exception. If you are a spades player, then you know this phrase. This is a phrase you would use when you're predicting how many books you have in your hand. It
Yes.
also represents the essence of cultural preservation, which is not just a conversation with the past, but one that concerns the future as well. Three and a Possible is predictive. Through this series, I will be chatting with experts in the preservation space and asking 3 and possibly 4 questions per interview. This is a free-flowing discussions with my community of practice. So without further ado, welcome to the show. Andrea, it's so great to see you.
It's great to see you, fellow Texan.
Yeah, we'll get into that. So
Yes.
Andrew, again, super excited to have you on the show. So we're gonna start with big picture in mind, and I'm just curious, what experiences brought you into this field? How did you learn about preservation, and how did you kick off the work that you're currently leading?
I'll just tell you about some moments. I can't say it was exactly sequential, but I had a few things happen. First, I was getting my master's at University of Pennsylvania in public administration, public finance. And while I was there, to really build community and feel less like a fish out of water, I found a faith community, Calvary Church in West Philadelphia on Baltimore Avenue. And while I was a member there, they said, "Hey, we got a community center as part of our church that's trying to rent out space, but we also are a community hub, and we have a small congregation, and it's a 118-year-old church, and we want to make it beautiful again. And we need someone to help us. Oh, you are public finance. We need you to help us." And so I started becoming a part of that work, just as someone who's helping with the books, running Quicken, like
Yeah,
not fancy, right?
but
And
important work.
but important, right? And so, and the leadership of the center that lived in the church was like, "Hey, we need to write these grants." So then I would meet partners in sacred spaces, or I'm saying the name wrong, can't remember it. But partners in sacred
Yep.
spaces. I also saw or ran into all these funders, and then I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is too great. This is too good to be true." I thought, inside, this is something I would really love to do. I would love to be doing this full time. I would love to be thinking about how we're finding funding and how we're figuring out how we can do this part of the project and then this part of the project, and then how we can make a space that was for one use, more uses. And I only have one small role in this, right? I'm just helping with the books. I'm at board meetings. I'm showing up. And then I'm with this very diverse community because it's a Methodist church, but it's a reconciling congregation. So everybody who's involved are sometimes of different faiths. They're all genders and sexualities. They're Black, they're white. And I was like, this is an amazing community. And they're all bound by not just the faith in the church, but of the possibility what the building could be for West Philadelphia. So that really stayed with me as a kind of space community experience that I wanted to have, but I didn't have envisioned yet how that could happen. And then the other thing that happened that really led me down this road was while I was working, and you notice these are kind of semi-professional experiences. I was working at the city of Houston, and part of the consolidated planning process. So, communities have community development block grants.
Yep.
And to receive those funds, you have to write a plan. You have to write an annual, and then you have to write a 5-year, and you have to do it with community. And what I kept running into were community members who were saying, "Well, the meeting's always happening downtown, and I don't see it or feel it, in our community. We have to go down to City Hall and we have to ask you for money. We have to go, it's something that happens there. And so I brought it out to the community. I said, okay, everybody, let's take the show on the road. Didn't necessarily go great, in terms of, if you want an engagement opportunity to go in order and not have people, say, hey, I got this problem. I want this taken care of, that taken care of. Well, it was great for the community of Sunnyside because they got to say what they wanted to say, but it wasn't so neat and clean for everybody else. And in the course of that, of being in Sunnyside and having the meeting out in, I think we had it out in Acres Home, the other meeting, I had a sense that these communities, unless they were framed as neighborhoods, they weren't framed as places. And when we were mapping out or thinking about how we apportion funds and where we go to do outreach, it was this language of HUD around concentrations, right? About concentrations of poverty and then concentrations by race. And there was this kind of underlying kind of ghettoization of negativity of, just not the kind of connotations that you want when you're thinking about historic communities of color. So ideally, right, you want to have communities' identities preserved. Mm-hmm. And you want them recognized as not just a place people were pushed to. And you want them to have voice. And what we ran into, or what I ran into in this process, was this feeling that the true nature of these cultural landscapes in these places was invisible in planning. Unless you could see a concentration of Black voters. Okay, we care about these Black neighborhoods because I know if I go to a church there, we're going to pick up a lot of votes and a lot of attention. Those are kind of interspersed and scattered, and they don't live there anymore. So I'm going to go over here. I care about this Black settlement and this Black settlement because that's where I can see there's a crowd of people. Mm-hmm. And then the last piece that made me interested in rethinking this whole historic preservation piece as being something that's not just about where we're concentrated and where it's easy to get to us is my own family story was bubbling up from the surface. I was losing family members. I was going to the family cemetery. I was learning about my own family's role in creating the family cemetery and being part of a mutual aid society that started that cemetery, and that these mutual aid societies were part of this larger network of people across states, 3 states. 31,000 were part of the Farmers Improvement Society of Texas, which became the Farmers Improvement Society in Louisiana and Arkansas as well. And that led me to learn about what kind of places they were founding. And I found the book Freedom Colonies. But what I found in this book, Freedom Colonies, was a list in the back of the book. And the list was a list of places thought to possibly be freedom colonies, historic Black settlements founded after emancipation in Texas, 1865. So 1865 to 1930, what are the places we intentionally created? And I became obsessed. So I'm still working at the city of Houston, and I'm contemplating loss, and I'm spending time in the cemetery, and I'm talking to my late Grandma Vi, and she's pulling out baggies full of funeral programs. And I'm seeing the funeral programs of people I lost, but then people generations back associated with the Riceville community. And I was like, we have a history, we have a story. And then I was thinking, well, I'm not the only one who has a history and a story. And that's connected to named places, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was those combinations of that professional experience, that personal experience, that service experience of building community, sort of the pluralistic building of community when you're living out of place, all of those experiences that led me to thinking about heritage and place, and particularly the heritage of Black place making. So that's what got me into the historic preservation thinking world and want to return to academia to pursue a PhD in planning, community and regional planning, and focus in on preservation planning.
Okay, that is an incredible story, and very serendipitous how these moments, like flashes, and it's kind of all lined up. And as I'm thinking through, there's a saying, we both know it. Life makes sense kind of looking backwards. When you kind of step back and you look like, okay, that needed to happen to allow this to happen, to allow this to
Precisely.
happen, for this all to come together in and at this particular moment.
Yes.
So here's another question. Let's go a little further back and let's talk about our Texas connection.
Yes.
So you are a sixth generation Texan, and
Yes.
I'm curious. So we know that there are freedom colonies in Oklahoma and in Kansas,
Oh, yeah.
Louisiana, across the country. So tell me what makes Texas so special. Of course, it's near and dear to both of our hearts. My family's coming from East Texas as well. Now we're primarily in Central and Southern Texas,
Mm.
but tell me your journey as a Texan, and really what took you into public finance. Like, what was it about it?
Oh,
And
goodness.
then when you get to this point, why is Texas such an important place for you to work?
So we have the story of Juneteenth, and I had relatives that always were excited about and celebrated Juneteenth, and I had other relatives that weren't excited and just were irritated by it because they were embarrassed, because they thought it was some reflection on how backwards Texas was, that we didn't get the message till 1865, that they managed to get a few more crops out of a worth of work and crops out of us
Hmm.
than the rest of the country. So there was this kind of mixed connotation, but some of my happiest memories growing up were Juneteenth. It was the food, it was the gathering, it was the Miller Outdoor Theater Houston events of concerts on Juneteenth, um, the family gatherings, the togetherness. And so my rootedness in Texas is very much about family and connections to family, in the ways that they commemorated their own sort of showing themselves to themselves,
Hmm.
right? And being able to um, show themselves outside of what they had to be at work every day, right? So that really got me motivated, interested in delving deep into my own kind of connection to Texas. And when I started to do that, what I found out was that I had relatives who had been a part of the runaway scrape, which people don't talk in Texas about the runaway scrape because it's the moment when they retreated. Rather than the Alamo, it's a moment of retreat. And there were enslaved people around during the runaway scrape. So I was beginning to talk to other distant relatives, sometimes on Ancestry, sometimes just actual, relatives, and getting them to remember things. And I realized we had an early presence in the state. We had a really early presence in the state. And what that did for me is said, well, this is mine, right? There's this connotation that when you talk about Blackness in Texas, well, that is associated with being urban and in cities. And the story of historic preservation and the story of Blackness is city, city, city,
Yep.
all day, every day, which is great. But how do we get to the cities? So what makes Freedom Colonies unique is that they are close to their point of origin, and they're close to rather major cities. So we have stories of Mississippi to Chicago, right? Well, we could go from, you know, Dixie Community, Possum Trot to Dallas. And Dallas would be the Mecca that they
Right.
would go
Right.
to. So that means I can get in a car and I can be back in East Texas in 2 to 3 hours, less than that, depending on where your freedom colony is. So that means that there is more frequent connection than it would be if we're talking about Mississippi, right?
Mhm.
And how you're going to get between Mississippi and Chicago. It's a lot different. So there's frequency of contact, which means there's a sustainability factor in how often and how frequent people are commemorating place, remembering the place founders, returning to the cemeteries. And so all of that makes it unique in the sense that there's such close proximity. It's a
Mhm.
touchstone that people are returning to. and we're such a fast growing state. So we have a lot of land and a lot of space in Texas. But what we also have is just exponential, just quick, expansive growth, which
Yeah.
means the interaction and the abutting of Black land, Black owned land in these freedom colonies is it's an urgent issue. So it's the internal city issues for sure of, oh my gosh, we're growing really quickly. We don't have enough housing. We have all these issues. But there's also the big problem of, oh my gosh, we're right outside of College Station, Texas, let's
Mhm.
say, where there's major issues around land loss and frankly, land theft. Black land theft is what it is.
That's a whole conversation. That's a
That's the
whole.
whole conversation. But what's unique is just that proximity and these growth pressures and the way that they're making the once urban, I mean, rural areas, making them exurban, making them become bedroom communities all of a sudden. So the landscape is changing quickly in Texas in ways that endanger freedom colonies and endanger Black land ownership. And that endangers being able to recognize the settlement pattern and being able to really own the place.
No, I really like the point you made about this cultural sustainability. Like it's easier you go to what was the
Well,
possum
possum trot, yes. Yeah,
trot
it's just an example of freedom
yeah,
colony.
to Dallas when you know you're thinking about
Yeah.
like Black migratory patterns. Like yes, Mississippi to Chicago, bringing the Delta blues. But I tell you this for the people in California, y'all barbecue is so good because a lot of Black folks moved from California, from Texas to
Oh,
California.
oh, for
Um,
sure. No question. I mean, LA was at one point 20% Black people from, or 20% of all Black people from Texas at one time and were from Texas and LA. So LA was a big, just full of African American Texans,
yeah,
right?
yeah. That I did not know that number was so huge, but I
It is
definitely knew
huge.
for a fact that those migratory patterns. But you think
Yeah.
about that, like the connection to the land, like not leaving the
Yeah.
state but moving to the big city, and you know, being from Waco, the big city is like okay, it's Dallas, it's a Houston, it's a
Yeah.
San Antonio, it's Austin, and then all of these small towns that really make up Texas are in between, right? Uh, and and
Yes.
and so right now we have there's a few pictures scrolling, and I wanted
Oh,
to give some time to talk about your work
sure.
around Texas Freedom Colonies
Sure.
uh, and the Black settlement history. So I'll give you the floor to talk about your work at the UVA Center for Cultural Landscapes.
Sure. Sure. So I will say the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, just to give people a brief background on its origin, while I was pursuing my PhD, I began to learn about a particular freedom colony called Shankleville. And through my interaction with Shankleville and learning about their foundational or their creation story, I began to learn about the relationship between the creation story and how that actually catalyzed or caused people to engage, right? Who were living in diaspora. It made people return for homecoming. So it wasn't that Shankleville was the only place that had a homecoming, or Shankleville was the only place that had a creation story, but it was my encounter for how this particular set of descendants were using that to get people to return and reinvest their time and in land stewardship, in the cemetery upkeep, in the placing of a historic homestead on the National Register of Historic Places. And they had leadership amongst their descendants that wanted to grow. They wanted to think about agritourism. They wanted to think about how they use a annual food festival or food heritage to draw people in to have a larger festival. How do you have you have at Edenville, you have the Zora Festival. How do you recreate that in a place like Texas? So you had people like Laretha Clay who had that vision and thinking about what they wanted for the future of Shankleville. And so I said, well, there's a lot of other people who live in this area that I'm meeting at your homecoming, and there are more freedom colonies. So how might we draw those people into what you're doing And she said, oh, yeah, we do a symposium. We had our first one last year. And I said, well, let me help you with your symposium and also make that part of my doctoral work. So let's have a testimony service. Let's get people, we're in a church, so let's do what we do in church. We give people an opportunity. It's the most egalitarian moment in the Sunday service where everybody has their say. And so we had descendants speak out. And we had a set of questions that they all answered. And these same questions are what you see when you go to the Texas Freedom Colonies Project website, when you go to the Atlas. These became the questions around how did you create, what's the creation story? How many times do you return? What do you need? What's it like to interact with planning officials or preservation officials? How do you, all of these questions that I was asking about the history, the present, and their future are in the Black Settlement Survey that I used. And I began to look at the surveys and I said, you know what? I want to demonstrate that this is a commitment and that it's not just my dissertation. And so that's what made me call it the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, Atlas and Study, because I wanted to demonstrate that this wasn't a one-off. It wasn't about one settlement. It was about all the settlements we invited to speak out that day that were represented at that testimony service. And it was about all of the freedom colonies in the back of the book that I began to say, well, is that really a freedom colony? How would we go about verifying them? How the heck would we try to talk to everybody in the entire state? Well, I found that there were two counties, one that contained Shankleville, Newton, and Jasper counties. And the back of the book said, oh, there's 17 freedom colonies. Well, the back of the book was not inclusive of the total of 34 freedom colonies that after the interviews and spending time in not just Shankleville, but extensive time in 9 other settlements with people who were descendants of all of the areas or all of the communities and how they define the communities, the words they use. And I got a much more expansive idea of what a freedom colony is or was and what people's connections are. And then I thought, oh, so how might we think about, instead of being so reactive and wondering about who's going to attack or who might try to take freedom colony land and how they might build on top of cemeteries, what if we had an apparatus or some kind of platform where people could register their freedom colony or make it visible in this space when there's nothing there, so that we would have less excuse as planning and preservation professionals to say, I didn't know it was there. I can't find the stakeholders. Could we be a proxy stakeholder when they can't find folks? And that led me to, that was sort of the last paragraph of my dissertation of like, what if we did all of that? And so I spent the year after that developing the book proposal about what I was learning in freedom colonies, and then developing this plan for the Atlas and Study, for the actual larger study, which would be the entire state of Texas. So I guess I'm saying that the idea, the kernel of it was from the interactions and from the experiences. And then I began to think of it as the question of what would happen if I developed an online space for people to share their stories. So myself and a student, his name is Muhammad Biazar, got together and figured out how we would build this online apparatus by first finding 375. So before we went and asked people, we said, how many can we find on our own? Meaning we can find a point on a map associated with a church, a school, a cemetery, or a namesake of this freedom colony, verify that it's African-American, and verify, using census data, using publicly data that we all already say. They're often the places say, did you look there? People say, did you look there? And I said, yes, we looked there first. We looked at the historical markers. We looked at all of the places you look at first. And we started the map, and then we invited the public to fill in the gaps by saying, we have these names. We have these different sources that say, these are the names by county of freedom colonies here. Can you tell us something about these places? Do you remember something about these places? Some people were descendants and they could, and other people were not. And so what we found, or what I'm finding from amassing this information, is a lot that we have 1,100 entries in there that you don't see, because so much of it is, are people asking questions, people not sure it's a freedom colony or not. But we're finding a lot about what constitutes a Black landscape, and what constitutes the Black landscape of, what's the landscape of placemaking, of Black placemaking and place creation.
Right.
And so at the Center for Cultural Landscapes, that is the work. It has been, since it was created in 2015 by Beth Meyer, a place where you do the deepest dives into place histories and place heritage. You do a deep dive into the ecology, the environment, the development that happens there, the design that happens there. It is a space that's always been the most comprehensive in its thinking about cultural landscapes. And so when I was invited to join the faculty at the University of Virginia, and I learned that I would be able to have a role or convert my work into something that's a basis for how we look at all cultural landscapes, I go, oh, this center, yeah, this is a place to do that work. So the center's not the Texas Freedom Colonies Project Center. It is the center for us to think as expansively as possible about cultural landscapes, and how that gives us the most holistic way to think about place. It's the buildings, it's the earth, it's the air, it's the water, it's the memories, it's the people. And the cultural landscape perspective is what allowed me to make Freedom Colonies visible, because I could take into account what people said, what they remembered.
Yep.
All the elements of place.
Yeah. Which is why I think your work is so innovative for so many reasons. But the one with the atlas and being proactive, and for those who are in preservation, in planning, a lot of the work we do is we're reacting sometimes. I'm talking to people out in the
Yes.
audience. So
Yes.
to say not if this happens, or when generations transition, this is inevitable, but to plan for it, like we know this is coming. Let's be proactive
Right.
and document and have a record of
Yes.
these places that are important. And again, underscoring like places and cultural landscapes, to hit home Andrea's point again, is preservation. And this work is not just solely focusing on buildings or on cemeteries.
Correct.
There are a lot of places, there are a lot of things that encompass what we remember. These memory scapes are important. And we have to, and the vocabulary that Dr. Roberts is articulating about incorporating the descendants of freedom colonies or inhabitants of freedom colonies as a part of that, like elevating that to the level of importance in preservation. There's really no real space for that. So to be expansive, you have to think outside of these boxes. You have to create space for these conversations to enter, because they don't fit into these nice boxes that were designed for communities that don't look like the ones that we want to serve. So I just think this project, this work, it is at the cutting edge of cultural preservation in the nation, and I would dare say internationally.
Thank you for that. But I attribute that to everyone that I've worked with in trying to create Texas Freedom Colonies Project and make this transition from the Texas to the expansive Freedom Colonies hemisphere kind of project is the vision. Yeah. And I would say, if not for my students, who I had all these great PhD students, there's Skylar Carter, there's Jennifer Blanks, there's Grace Kelly, all of these great students who stepped up. And I would say, hey, by the way, what would it be like if we had a talk show during the pandemic? How would we do that? What might we call it? And I could turn to the students and they'd say, oh, well, we could call it coffee talk, and we could have people on, and we could try to arrange for them to talk about different topics. So I made it a playground for them, but also a training ground for them to think about all the ways we can connect with descendant community on an ongoing basis. How do we listen to people? How do we factor in what they bring to the table? All of those were things that were in part made either possible by students I work with or the descendant community, the descendant preservationists that I've had an opportunity to work with over time, that I'm excited about the next season, continuing to work with both students and descendants.
Yeah. So Andrea, we could go on and keep
I know.
talking. But you said something as I'm thinking about this conversation. So I
Yeah.
always ask guests the future of what's the future of
Yes.
preservation, and something that we were talking about pre-call was, the your students understanding and respecting the people behind the work. That it's just not theory when you're introduced to a topic.
Yes.
There's there are sometimes students who don't have the chance or the opportunity to get out into the field. They don't know when the rubber meets the road. How to really approach this work with the level of respect and intellectual rigor that it requires. And so to that so that is our grounding, is kind of thinking about what is the future of this work, thinking about what your students are doing, what people who want to work with you and haven't
Mm.
had the chance to work with you before, what should we be thinking about in the next 50 years of this field that we call preservation, cultural, historic, all the ways that people describe
Yeah.
preservation. What's the future of this field?
So one of the things that is essential is to think about both the the specificity of place and honoring it, but also thinking intersectionality, intersectional way about the specific compounding oppressions that different communities confront, specifically freedom colonies. And the nature of that is to think specifically about the way that climate and racism and land loss make it almost impossible to think about how we want to preserve. We have to think about preservation as intersecting and uniquely acting together in a particular way to undermine freedom colony or Black settlement descendants and to undermine the sustainability of these places. So the future is thinking in this very intersectional way about preservation. Because you can't do anything. You can't put it on the National Register. You can't think about how you're going to plan for the future when you can destroy a settlement through partition sales. So that's, if somebody asks you what's a big problem, it's land retention and the environmental justice issues, which have to be part of our conversation going forward. The other piece is, in working with me, is this thing that I'm calling outsider preservation. And so people think of preservation as being intrinsically like, oh, it's always been grassroots. Oh, it's always been activists. Well, I would argue that there's a way that historic preservation creates an elitism even among its grassroots. It creates an outside inside. It creates a this is special, that is not. This is more special, that is not. And while we want to recognize historic places, while we want to address and make visible the significance of these places, we want to think about how many people we can include rather than exclude. And so outsider preservation is a concept and an idea taken from the outsider artist tradition of people who are self-taught artists. Some people call them intuitive artists, folk artists. Mm-hmm. And it's that tradition in historic preservation among people who don't know they're preservationists, who are engaged in these struggles and these battles and think that they are alone, who don't have the degree, who have been engaging in cultural, commemorative, ritual practices that constitute preservation practice, that I'm trying to bring into the academic space and into the spaces where they can attain funding and the support they need to advance these innovative, different ways of thinking about which places matter and why, and how we commemorate them, how we protect them, and how we teach a new American history based on what we find. So to me, this outsiderness, that bringing the outside, what we used to call in certain families, the outside children in, to preservation.
Yeah, no, I think those are that is great. And as you were talking, it reminded me of this example at the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park, where the AME Zion Church for 100 years stewarded the property where Harriet Tubman had
Mm,
her funeral in 1913. And
wow.
the way that they didn't necessarily use, when I was speaking with them, the preservation language, but at understanding the significance of this place allowed them to preserve this for generations, for two generations at
Yes.
the very least. And
Yeah.
so that is like those types of, particularly when it comes to like Black churches or Black cemeteries, or these places where these are, these are, there are cultural connections to them that may not have that they're not using the language around preservation, but inherently understand the importance of cultural legacy and legacy keeping and place keeping. These are, you are absolutely spot on. There are a number of examples of this outsider preservationist being an important role, when oftentimes the preservation establishment didn't recognize this history, didn't value in
Didn't
it.
recognize it, didn't value it, assume that there's no preservation going on, that these people don't know what preservation is, that they don't know why their place matters. How come I can't make them understand why it matters when they're
Yeah,
full-fledged, been engaged,
yeah,
been
but not
participating?
for the stewardship of these people who saw
Correct.
this vision decades before. There wouldn't be these places to help
That's
manage
correct.
to create these stories. So
Yes.
I, Andrea, Dr. Roberts, that is an important piece, and I also appreciate you bringing up intersectionality and land loss and environmental justice, all parts or all conversations that anybody who's working in this preservation space in any shape, way, or form should bring themselves to this table, because it's these conversations are already happening without us, and to be relevant in these spaces, to be impactful, to bring this perspective, we have to have the language to talk about all the ways that history has presented itself and is tangible on the landscape.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Okay.
much for having me.
Andrea, thank you so much for your time. This has been a phenomenal conversation. I really appreciate you for again taking the time to chat with me. And for those still watching, we have an episode coming up next week with Nikita Reed for Three and the Possible at 11 a.m. Eastern. Same bat time, same bat channel. So with that being said, thank you all for joining in, and I will see you next time. Have a great